The day they told the court my daughter was too broke to fight for her own child, something in me went cold so fast it felt like my blood had turned to glass. I sat 3 rows behind her, hands folded over a notebook I had not opened yet, and listened while people with polished shoes and expensive voices described her like she was a bad investment. Then the judge looked up, noticed the way I had been writing names and dates from memory, and asked the question that changed the whole room. He wanted to know who I was. By then, the damage had already been done. My daughter Lena was 29 years old, widowed, running on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, and trying not to fall apart in public because once a woman cries in a courtroom, too many people stop hearing her words and start measuring her stability. She wore the only navy blouse she said made her feel steady, though I could see her fingers trembling where they gripped the edge of the table. Across from her sat the parents of her late husband, polished and composed, flanked by a family attorney so famous in our county his billable rate was probably more than Lena's rent. They had come to take her daughter, my granddaughter, and they were doing it with the kind of calm that only money seems to buy. It hadn't started in court, it never does. Things like this start quietly in kitchens and hospitals and driveways, in the soft moments when people think grief makes you too weak to notice what they're really doing. 6 months earlier, Lena's husband, Grant, had died when his car crossed the median on a rain-slick stretch of highway just outside Millbrook. He was 33. One minute my daughter had a husband and a home and the ordinary mess of married life. The next minute she was standing under fluorescent hospital lights, with mascara drying into salt at the corners of her eyes, trying to understand why the doctor had stopped using the present tense. Lena and Grant had been married for 7 years. They had one little girl, Sophie, who was 5 and had the kind of laugh that made strangers turn and smile without even knowing why. Grant came from old money, or at least the kind of money that liked to dress itself as tradition. His parents, Richard and Evelyn Mercer, lived in a brick estate with trimmed hedges and framed portraits and a dining room nobody ever relaxed in. They had accepted Lena when Grant married her, but only in that thin, performative way some families do, where every kindness comes wrapped in a reminder that you were invited in, not born there. Evelyn bought Lena clothes she had not asked for in sizes slightly too small. Richard once offered to explain compound interest at Thanksgiving after Lena mentioned she was balancing student loans. Grant used to laugh it off, and Lena used to do that thing so many decent people do when they're being diminished. She told herself it was easier not to make a scene. I noticed it long before she did. A father always notices the small cuts. He notices who interrupts his daughter. He notices who says her name like a correction instead of an affection. He notices when gifts are really leashes. But Lena loved Grant, and for a long time Grant loved her well enough that I convinced myself the rest of it could be endured. If you've ever watched someone you love excuse disrespect because they're trying to keep the peace, you know exactly how helpless that feels. You want to drag them out of the room and also trust them enough to let them stay. That tension can tear a person in half. After Grant died, the Mercers moved with terrifying speed. At first it looked like support. Evelyn started bringing casseroles Lena never touched. Richard offered to handle the paperwork, which turned out to mean everything from insurance claims to access to Grant's business accounts. Their attorney began advising Lena on probate issues before she had even chosen what dress Sophie would wear to the funeral. They told her not to worry about money because family took care of family. That sounds beautiful until you realize some people define taking care as taking over. Lena was too numb to see it for what it was. I was not. 3 days after the funeral, she called me in a voice so thin I barely recognized it and said one of Grant's credit cards had stopped working at the grocery store. By the end of the week, she had learned that the joint account she and Grant used for household expenses had been frozen pending review of estate structures she had never seen. The house they lived in was not in Grant's name after all. It belonged to a Mercer family trust. The SUV was leased through one of Richard's companies. Even the preschool Sophie attended had been prepaid by Evelyn in a way that made withdrawing her feel less like a choice and more like a threat. My daughter had been living inside a life that looked shared but was built almost entirely on someone else's permission. That realization hit her harder than the funeral. Grief is one kind of pain, humiliation is another. I remember sitting across from her at my kitchen table while unpaid bills spread between us like evidence from a crime scene. Her lips were so dry they had gone pale. She kept apologizing for not understanding their finances sooner, and every time she did, I felt my jaw tighten a little harder. She had stayed home for 2 years when Sophie was born because Grant asked her to. Then she went back to part-time work at a community arts center because that was what fit their childcare situation. Nothing about her choices had been reckless. She had trusted her husband. And trust, when it's broken by death or deceit, leaves a bruise you can't point to on your skin. At first, the Mercers framed everything as temporary. Sophie could stay with them on weekends so Lena could rest. Richard could cover certain expenses if Lena signed some documents. Evelyn could help choose a better school district if Lena decided to move somewhere more manageable. It all came wrapped in concern. That was the most dangerous part. Cruelty is easier to resist when it arrives shouting. What Lena got was control dressed up as rescue. And rescue is hard to refuse when your bank account is down to a number that makes your stomach drop. Then came the first real crack in the mask. Sophie spent one Saturday night at the Mercer's house and came back asking whether Mommy was too sad to keep her safe. The words landed in the room and sat there ugly and heavy. Lena went completely still. I watched her blink once twice like she could force the sentence into some shape that hurt less, but there was no softer meaning hidden inside it. Somebody had put adult fear into a little girl's mouth and sent her home with it. That was the moment I stopped hoping this was grief making everyone selfish and started seeing it for what it was. They were building a case. Lena confronted Evelyn the next morning. I only know the details because she came to my house afterward and sat in the driveway for 10 full minutes before she could trust her legs enough to get out of the car. Evelyn denied saying anything directly, of course. She said children misinterpret. She said maybe Sophie had picked up on Lena's episodes. Episodes, that was the word. Lena had been in grief counseling twice a month since Grant died, and somehow that private attempt to keep herself from drowning had been turned into proof that she was unstable in the water. My daughter pressed the heel of her hand to her chest as she told me all this, like she was physically trying to hold herself together. I had to look away for a second because fathers are not made to hear that kind of injury from their children and stay calm. I told Lena then that she needed a lawyer. She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. It was the sound people make when the math has already crushed the idea before they can even consider it. She showed me what was left in her account, what the arts center paid her, what childcare would cost if she picked up more hours, what the mortgage equivalent on any decent rental in her school zone would be. I had savings, but not enough to sustain a custody war against a family like the Mercers. Not if they decided to drag it out, and families like theirs always do. Money can turn the legal system into a waiting game, and waiting is easiest for the people who can afford not to break first. What Lena did have was pride, and I understood that because she got it from me. She did not want to beg. She did not want to become the story Richard and Evelyn were already telling about her, the young widow who could not cope, could not provide, could not manage without them. So she tried to cooperate. She sent polite emails. She created a calendar for Sophie's visits. She documented every exchange. She swallowed anger so often I thought it might poison her from the inside out. For a few weeks, it seemed possible the situation might settle into an uneasy peace. Then Richard filed for temporary guardianship. The petition claimed Sophie needed continuity, financial stability, and an emotionally structured environment while Lena addressed her ongoing mental and economic limitations. I will never forget reading that line. My fingertips actually went numb on the paper. There is something especially vicious about wealthy people using the consequences of their own control as evidence that someone else is unfit. They had tightened every financial screw they could reach and then pointed to the struggle as proof she was failing. That was when I understood something that still sits inside me like a stone. They did not want what was best for Sophie. They wanted what was easiest to own. That line still stops me when I think about it, because once you see ownership where love was pretending to stand, you can never unsee it. Lena fell apart that night in a way I had not seen since she was 12 years old, and her mother was dying in the room down T. Hall, she did not scream. That would have been easier to witness. She just folded in on herself at my kitchen sink, both hands gripping the counter, shoulders shaking so hard the silverware in the drying rack rattled. She kept saying Sophie's name like a prayer that had forgotten how to be hopeful. I stood behind her and put one hand between her shoulder blades, feeling every shudder under my palm, and I realized the line we had been trying not to cross had already disappeared behind us. This was war, quiet, polished, devastating war. There was just one problem. Lena was right. We could not afford the kind of lawyer the Mercers would hire. There are things children never fully know about their parents, even when they love them well. They know the outlines. They know the habits, the scars, the phrases you repeat without realizing it. But there are rooms inside a life that stay closed unless something forces them open. Lena knew I had once been a lawyer. She knew that before I owned my hardware store, before I spent years smelling like cedar and machine oil, before life turned me into the man who fixed broken cabinet doors for neighbors and waved at every dog in town, I had practiced law. What she did not know was how much of that life I had buried on purpose. She did not know I had been very good at it. She did not know I had stopped because winning had started to feel too expensive after her mother got sick, and the hours I spent in court began to feel like theft from home. And she certainly did not know I had quietly kept my license active all these years, filing the paperwork every renewal cycle out of habit or guilt or some stubborn part of me that could not bear to shut that door completely. I had not stepped into a courtroom as counsel in almost 15 years. When I told Lena I might be able to help, the first thing she did was stare at me like I had spoken in another language. Then she shook her head so hard loose strands of hair stuck to the wet tracks on her cheeks. She said no in all the ways a daughter says no when she loves her father and knows exactly how old he is, how long it has been, how much he has already lost. My wife, her mother, died of pancreatic cancer at 48. 2 years later, my son Ben was killed by a drunk driver 3 months after his college graduation. There are griefs that age a man more honestly than time. Lena had watched that happen to me. She knew what courtroom battles used to cost me. She knew the law had once hollowed me out and left me pacing hospital parking lots with a tie still around my neck because I had gone straight from a hearing to bad news and then to worse. So I understood why she resisted. I also knew resistance had become a luxury we no longer possessed. I pulled out the old leather briefcase from the back of my bedroom closet that same night. It smelled like dust and paper and a version of myself I had spent years pretending was gone. The brass latch stuck for a second before giving way. Inside were legal pads, a fountain pen my wife gave me when I won my first jury trial, and a set of reading glasses so outdated they made me laugh despite everything. Lena stood in the doorway watching me like she was seeing a ghost sort through evidence of his own existence. My hands were steady until I touched the pen, then I had to sit down. People love to talk about courage like it feels noble in the moment. Most of the time it does not. Most of the time it feels like nausea and memory and a pressure behind your ribs so sharp you cannot take a full breath. That night, courage felt like admitting I was afraid to go back and doing it anyway. The next week became a blur of affidavits, requests for records, motions, financial disclosures, and the kind of cold strategic thinking I had spent years trying to replace with a quieter life. I learned quickly that the Mercers had prepared more thoroughly than even I expected. They had statements from Sophie's private school teacher noting that Lena seemed emotionally strained at pickup after Grant's funeral. They had copies of text messages from grief support evenings when Lena had asked Evelyn to keep Sophie overnight because she was exhausted. They had photographs of Sophie's room at Lena's rental, cropped so tightly the loving details vanished and only the plainness remained. Worst of all, they had a therapist's letter from a clinician Lena had seen exactly twice, written so vaguely it managed to be both technically cautious and emotionally damning. In black and white, grief becomes suspicious very quickly. But while they had money, they also had arrogance, and arrogance leaves fingerprints everywhere. Richard had signed an email about maintaining the Mercer legacy in the child's primary environment. Evelyn had forwarded school enrollment forms to a private academy before any guardianship order existed. Their attorney had sent one truly remarkable letter implying that a cooperative resolution might include Delana moving out of state while Sophie remained in regular contact with her grandparents. Reading that, I felt a slow heat rise from the base of my neck. There it was, stripped clean of pretense. They did not want to help my daughter heal. They wanted to erase her gently enough that they could still call themselves compassionate. If you have ever seen people mistake money for moral authority, then you know how they carry themselves. Not louder, not meaner even, just certain. Certain the room belongs to them. Certain the rules bend best around people who can fund the bending. Certain a tired woman with a limited bank account will eventually surrender because surrender is cheaper than dignity. Lena almost did. That is the part people rarely admit. The bravest person in a story is usually not brave every hour. 3 weeks before the hearing, she came to my store near closing and sat on a paint bucket in aisle 7 while I counted the register. She looked so worn down her face seemed to have been rubbed thin. She told me she was considering signing a temporary residential arrangement if it guaranteed time with Sophie and ended the public fight. She said maybe Sophie would be better off in a bigger house with fewer problems. As she spoke, she pressed her nails into her palms so hard little crescent marks appeared in the skin. I walked around the counter and knelt in front of her, and I had to choose my words carefully because there are moments when the wrong sentence can lodge inside someone for years. I told her that being exhausted does not mean being wrong. I told her rich people had been teaching struggling mothers to confuse poverty with unworthiness for generations. I told her Sophie did not need a perfect life arranged by a committee. She needed the person whose voice she looked for when she woke from a bad dream. Then I said the truest thing I knew, the line that later replayed in my own head through every minute of that hearing. They were counting her money because they were hoping nobody would count her love. Something changed in her face when I said that, not relief exactly. Relief comes later if it comes at all. What I saw was recognition, the kind that hurts before it helps. She finally saw what I had seen from the beginning. This fight was never really about whether she loved Sophie enough. It was about whether other people could weaponize her vulnerability and call it concern. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. Grant, for all his charm and all the genuine love I believe he had for Lena, had been keeping secrets. Not affairs or hidden families or anything that easy to hate. Worse in some ways, he had been borrowing against future distributions from the Mercer family business to cover losses from a side investment Richard had pressured him into joining. When those losses stacked up, Richard stepped in, but not out of generosity. He did it by tying more assets to trust structures that kept control in Mercer hands. Grant had tried to tell Lena pieces of this, I think. I found unfinished emails and discovery drafts that suggested as much. But he died before truth could catch up to image, and image is what Lena had been left to live inside. That was the next twist of the knife. She had not merely been excluded. She had been protected by omission until the protection itself became a trap. I did not tell her everything right away. Some truths need timing, and I needed her strong for the hearing. But I carried those documents home each night and spread them across my dining table under the yellow light, tracing connections with a pencil the way I used to when I prepared cross-examinations 30 years earlier. My back ached. My eyes blurred. Twice I woke at 3 a.m. with legal arguments already forming in my head before I had fully surfaced from sleep. The old instincts came back not like a lightning strike but like circulation returning to a numb limb, painful first, then undeniable. A week before court, the Mercers made their boldest move. Their attorney requested a private judicial interview with Sophie, arguing that the child's own comfort level would be relevant to temporary placement. Sophie was five, old enough to feel pressure, too young to understand manipulation, and exactly the age at which a carefully framed question can make a child think choosing comfort means choosing the nicer house. I filed an objection within the hour. Lena read the motion at my table and went so pale I thought she might faint. Her lips parted, but no sound came out for a few seconds. Then she whispered that they were turning Sophie into evidence. That sentence sat between us like broken glass. The night before the hearing, Lena finally asked me the question I had been dreading. She asked why I had really left the law, not the practical version, not the one about wanting more family time. The real reason. I looked at my daughter and saw my wife in the set of her mouth, Ben in the steadiness of her and I knew lies would feel like betrayal at that hour. So I told her. I told her I had left because after years of being the man people called when everything was already burning, I had forgotten how not to live in emergency. I told her that the day her mother began chemo, I spent the morning demolishing a witness on cross-examination and won the hearing exactly as planned, then sat in my car outside the oncology center and could not remember a single thing the doctor had said because my mind was still in battle. I told her I realized then that the law was not just my job anymore. It was the shape my nervous system had taken. I was winning cases and losing presence. And when Ben died, the courtroom stopped feeling like service and started feeling like punishment. Lena listened without interrupting. By the time I finished, my throat had gone tight and my fingers were wrapped so hard around a coffee mug they hurt. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her palm was warm, small like when she was a kid. She told me she never wanted to drag me back into the place that had taken so much from me. That nearly undid me. Because underneath all her terror, all her exhaustion, she was still thinking about the cost to me. That is who the Mercers were trying to paint as unstable. A woman who, with her own world collapsing, was still worried about hurting her father. Court mornings have their own weather, even indoors. The air always feels too dry. Shoes sound sharper on tile. Every face looks slightly unfinished, as if the people wearing them did not sleep enough to become fully human before sunrise. Lena and I arrived early. She carried a plain tote bag with documents, tissues, a granola bar she would not eat, and one small stuffed rabbit Sophie had shoved into her hands the night before for luck. I carried the briefcase. Dark brown suit, blue tie, reading glasses I had replaced with a pair that did not make me look embalmed. We walked through security side by side, not speaking. The elevator mirrored us back in hard silver light. She looked young and frightened. I looked old and calm. The truth was we were both acting. The Mercers entered with the smooth confidence of people accustomed to rooms rising subtly around their arrival. Evelyn wore cream. Richard wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. Their attorney, Martin Hale, gave me one glance and decided I was background. I recognized the calculation instantly. He saw a tired widower father come to offer emotional support to a daughter already outgunned. That misread would cost him later. Before the hearing began, Lena squeezed my arm once. Not hard, just enough to say what neither of us trusted our voices to carry. I covered her hand with mine. Her skin was cold. My own pulse had started to pound deep in my wrists, that old pretrial rhythm I had not felt in years. It frightened me how quickly the body remembers old wars. We took our seats. The clerk called the case. Martin Hale rose and launched into the kind of measured concern that sounds humane if you do not listen too carefully. He said the Mercers had provided continuity, educational enrichment, emotional supervision, and financial security in the aftermath of a devastating loss. He said Lena loved Sophie, of course, but love alone could not address the practical realities of long-term child welfare. Then, in one of those sentences lawyers say when they want a knife to sound like paperwork, he noted that Ms. Carter had appeared without formal counsel because she had not retained representation. He let that sentence rest exactly where he wanted it, hovering in the room like a verdict before the hearing had even begun. Then he added that while everyone sympathized with Ms. Carter's circumstances, the court could not ignore the disadvantages created by her economic limitations. My daughter's back stiffened. I watched her swallow, and for a second I thought she might cry. Not because the words were surprising, but because hearing your life reduced to economic limitations in a public room does something to the human body. It makes you feel translated into a language that was never built to hold your dignity. That was when the judge looked over his glasses at me. Maybe it was because I had begun writing as Hale spoke. Maybe it was because I had already tabbed exhibits in a file no ordinary support person would organize that way. Maybe it was because I was no longer bothering to hide the expression on my face. Whatever the reason, he paused and asked who I was. And just like that, 15 years fell away. I rose slowly because my knees are honest men, and honesty takes a second at my age. I gave my name for the record, Samuel Carter, father of Lena Carter, member of the state bar, active status. I stated that I was appearing on behalf of my daughter and requested permission to enter late due to emergency retention and accelerated proceedings. There are silences you hear with your ears, and there are silences you feel in the floor. This was the second kind. Judge Warren leaned back a fraction. Hale's expression shifted first to irritation, then to recognition, then to something much closer to concern. He knew my name. Most of the older lawyers in that courthouse did, though I had spent a long time out of sight. Judge Warren asked a follow-up question almost carefully this time and wanted to confirm whether I was the same Samuel Carter who had argued Holloway v. State before the appellate court. I told him I was, nothing flashy, nothing theatrical. Just the truth placed where everyone could see it. Evelyn Mercer's face drained of color so subtly most people would have missed it. Richard's jaw flexed once. Martin Hale recovered quickly because expensive lawyers train for that, but recovery is not the same as comfort. For the first time all morning, the certainty around their table cracked. I sat back down beside Lena and felt her staring at me like the room had tilted. Later, she would tell me that was the moment she finally understood why I had seemed strangely calm all week, why I had insisted on organizing exhibits myself, why I had slept so little without ever seeming lost. But in that moment, there was no time for explanation. There was only the work. What followed was the cleanest 2 hours of law I have ever practiced. Not the most brilliant, not the most dramatic, cleanest, because clarity is a gift age sometimes brings if grief does not kill you first. I no longer cared about performance. I no longer needed anyone in the room to admire me. All I wanted was the truth laid bare in an order the court could not ignore. I began with the emergency standard and forced the case back onto legal ground instead of moral theater. Temporary guardianship required actual proof of immediate harm, not polished speculation wrapped in concern. I walked through timelines, dates, communications, school records, counseling attendance, pediatric appointments never missed, rent paid even late, employment documentation. Character affidavits from neighbors, the art center director, Sophie's pediatrician, and a church daycare volunteer who had watched Lena kneel on cracked linoleum every pickup and wait until Sophie finished telling her one last story before they left. Real life, unwealthy life, unphotogenic life. The kind courts too often overlook because it does not come bound in leather. Then I started peeling back the Mercers' motives. I introduced the private school enrollment paperwork Evelyn had signed before filing the petition. I entered Richard's email about preserving the Mercer legacy in the child's primary environment. I moved in the letter proposing that Lena relocate while Sophie remained near the Mercers. Each document by itself could be brushed aside as context. Together they became pattern, not rescue, preselection, not support, strategy. Hale objected repeatedly. Some objections were decent, some were desperate. I answered each one in the same calm tone, never hurrying, never raising my voice. That was when I saw the courtroom begin to shift its weight. People can sense when a story they were prepared to accept is being dismantled piece by piece. You can almost hear their assumptions setting down their bags. The hardest part came when Lena had to testify. She looked at me once before taking the stand, and I saw fear flash through her so visibly it seemed to pass over her skin. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing had gone shallow. I wanted with every selfish cell in my body to keep her from that witness chair, but love does not always protect by removing pain. Sometimes love protects by standing close enough that someone can walk through it without disappearing. She testified simply, no theatrics, no perfect phrases. She talked about Sophie's routines, Grant's death, grief counseling, finances, job applications, the custody calendar, bedtime songs, the rabbit Sophie slept with when storms rolled in. Halfway through, when Hale tried to corner her into admitting that exhaustion had once made her ask Evelyn for overnight help, Lena's voice wavered. I thought she might break. Instead, she steadied herself on the edge of the witness box and said that asking for help while grieving should not be mistaken for abandoning your child. The whole room went still again, because there it was, the entire case stripped to its bones. If you have ever fought to stay human in a room designed to grade your weakness, you know how enormous that moment was. On cross, Hale tried to paint her as dependent, overwhelmed, inconsistent. He asked about the frozen accounts. He asked about reduced hours. He asked about counseling. He asked about the rental house, the old car I had lent her, the fact that Sophie's current school had a waiting list she could not guarantee if residential placement shifted. Each answer cost Lena something, I could see it, her knuckles blank. He did around a tissue until it tore, but every time he reached for shame, she handed him truth instead. Not polished truth, not defensive truth, just truth. And truth, when it survives that kind of pressure, becomes very hard to dislodge. Then came Richard. Men like Richard Mercer believe authority lives naturally in their posture. He took the stand with his shoulders squared and his grief arranged into a respectable shape. He spoke of stability, legacy, access to opportunities. He claimed he feared Lena's emotional fragility would impair Sophie's development. He called their home a place of structure and continuity. He said the petition had been filed out of love. I let him say it all. Then I asked him to identify his email about preserving the Mercer legacy. He tried to frame it as a grandfather's concern for heritage. I asked whether heritage required removing a child from her mother. He bristled. I asked why private school forms were signed before any finding of maternal unfitness. He said they were being proactive. I asked whether suggesting relocation for Lena while keeping Sophie local reflected support or separation. His face tightened. The room could feel it now, that slow collapse when a man accustomed to controlling the story realizes the documents have started answering for him. Finally, I asked the question I had saved all week. I asked whether he had ever once, in any of his written communications, proposed a solution that increased Lena's stability without reducing her time with Sophie. He tried to think. You could see it happen. Eyes shifting, mouth working, pride refusing to surrender to memory. He could not name one because there wasn't one. That was when the truth no longer needed me. Evelyn testified next and fared worse. The polished concern cracked under detail. She denied planting ideas in Sophie's mind, then admitted she had discussed adult worries within earshot of the child because children were more perceptive than people think. She said Lena's grief frightened Sophie, then admitted Sophie had asked to go home to her mother every Sunday night. She called the rental house unstable and then conceded she had never actually visited it. By then, even Martin Hale's objections had lost their edge. The room was no longer with him. Near the end, Hale made one last attempt to return to money. He argued that however unfortunate the Mercers' wording may have been, the material reality remained unchanged. They could offer more: better schools, better neighborhood, better healthcare access, better security. He did not say better mother because even he knew that line would snap in his hands. But the implication hung there anyway, cold and old and poisonous. If one home is wealthier, one home must be more worthy. I stood for rebuttal and felt every year of my life in my spine. My hands were no longer shaking. My chest, which had been tight all morning, suddenly felt clear enough to hold a full breath. I looked at the judge, then at the petitioners, then at my daughter sitting beside me with tear marks drying on her face and her whole future hanging on whether the room still believed poor meant lesser. And I said what I came there to say. I said the law does not auction children to the highest bidder. I said grief counseling is not evidence of danger but evidence of responsibility. I said financial hardship, especially hardship worsened by the controlling structures of the very people seeking custody, cannot be transformed into moral failure simply because someone rich has the resources to narrate it elegantly. I said the evidence showed not emergency but overreach, not rescue but replacement. And then I gave the line that people would repeat back to me for months afterward, the line that seemed to settle into the wood of the courtroom itself. They mistook her empty wallet for an empty spine. Nobody moved. I went on. I said a child learns love not by square footage but by whose arms she runs to when the world scares her. I said the petitioners had offered every advantage except the one thing they had no right to substitute: her mother. And I ended where the law and the heart for once happened to agree. I asked the court to deny the petition in full, restore Lena's primary authority, and instruct all parties that support without control is still possible if love is truly what they claim. Then I sat down. My legs almost gave out when I did. That is the truth of climaxes nobody tells you. They do not feel triumphant from the inside. They feel like your body realizing all at once what it has been carrying. Judge Warren recessed briefly, 10 minutes maybe. It felt like an hour poured through a keyhole. Lena and I sat without speaking. Her breathing was shaky. My palms had gone damp. Across the aisle, Richard stared forward with his jaw set so hard a muscle kept jumping near his temple. Evelyn dabbed at her eyes, though I could not tell whether it was grief, anger, or the humiliate iron of being seen clearly. When the judge returned, every sound in the room sharpened. Paper, shoes, a cough in the back row. My heartbeat had moved into my throat. He denied the guardianship petition. Not partially, not conditionally, denied. He stated that the evidence did not establish immediate risk, that grief and financial transition did not constitute parental unfitness, and that several actions by the petitioners suggested a troubling effort to predetermine custodial displacement rather than support maternal recovery. He restored full temporary decision-making authority to Lena pending final review of ancillary estate matters, warned all parties against involving the child in adult disputes, and recommended a structured family mediation process only if pursued without coercive leverage. Lena made a sound beside me I had never heard before. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, more like a body finally believing it can survive the next minute. My own vision blurred. I blinked hard, but the tears came anyway. I did not care. At my age, pride learns its proper place or it becomes ridiculous. Outside the courtroom, Lena turned to me in the hallway and just collapsed into my arms. Full weight, full grief, full relief. I held her the way I used to when thunderstorms shook the windows and she would pad into our room clutching a blanket and pretending she was only there because she could not sleep. Her shoulders heaved against my chest. Mine shook too. People passed us. Clerks, lawyers, strangers. I did not see any of them clearly. All I could feel was my daughter still here, still standing, not taken, not erased. Then Sophie came around the corner with my neighbor Mrs. Dobbins, who had watched her during the hearing. The minute she saw Lena, she ran, not politely, not uncertainly. She ran with that reckless little child trust that tells the whole truth before adults can dress it up. Lena dropped to her knees and gathered her so fast the rabbit fell from the tote bag onto the tile. Sophie wrapped both arms around her mother's neck and held on with complete conviction. There it was, the answer no filing could improve upon. Richard and Evelyn passed us on their way out. Richard looked older than he had that morning. Evelyn's mouth opened as if there might still be something she could say that would preserve her image of herself, but some moments do not permit repair through language. Lena did not glare, she did not plead. She simply stood with Sophie on her hip and one hand around the back of my arm, and the boundary in her face was clearer than any order the judge had signed. For the first time, they looked at her as if they understood she was no longer available for polite erasure. That should have been the end, but real endings are rarely so neat. Over the following months, there were mediation sessions, probate corrections, school forms, and the long, exhausting task of building a life not dependent on Mercer permission. I helped Lena find a small duplex 3 blocks from a park Sophie loved. The Arts Center offered her full-time program coordination after the director learned what had happened and decided decency should be actionable. We fought for access to funds Grant had intended for Sophie, and we won part of that too. Richard never apologized. Men like him often confuse losing with being wrong and try not to think about either. Evelyn sent gifts that Lena returned unopened. Boundaries, once learned late and hard, become sacred. There was one last truth I had to give Lena. A month after court, when the dust had settled enough for breathing to feel normal again, I showed her the discovery drafts proving Grant had known more about the family finances than he ever told her. She cried quietly, not with fresh devastation exactly, but with the dull ache of another layer giving way. She had to grieve him again, this time not only as the man she lost, but as the man who had loved her and still left her unprotected in ways that mattered. That is one of adulthood's cruelest lessons. Love is not always the same as safety. Good intentions are not the same as honesty. And sometimes the people we miss most are also the people whose silence cost us dearly. Lena asked me whether I hated him. I told her no, hate is too simple for the dead. I told her I thought Grant had been raised inside a system so controlled by his parents' money that he mistook dependence for normal and secrecy for peacekeeping. I told her that did not excuse what happened, but it explained how someone can love a person and still fail to stand between them and harm. She sat with that for a long time, staring out my kitchen window at the tomato plants her mother once kept alive every summer. Then she nodded. Not because the pain was gone, just because truth, once named, sometimes lets pain settle into a shape you can carry. As for me, I closed the briefcase and put it back in the closet 2 weeks later, not with bitterness this time. No. Even with relief, something stranger. Gratitude, maybe. I had spent years believing that chapter of my life had only taken from me. But standing beside Lena in that courtroom showed me something I had not known how to ask before. Maybe what nearly broke us can still become the thing we use to protect each other. Not because suffering is noble. It is not, but because survival teaches a language of recognition, and sometimes that language is exactly what love needs when polite words fail. Every now and then someone in town still brings up that hearing. They mention the surprise on Martin Hale's face, or the judge recognizing my name, or the way Richard Mercer looked when the ruling came down. Those details make for a satisfying story, I suppose. People like moments where power turns on itself. But when I think about that day, I do not think first about the courtroom. I think about the hallway after. I think about Sophie running. I think about Lena holding her with both arms and closing her eyes like she was memorizing the weight of what almost got taken. That is the image that stayed. Not victory, not revenge, return. Because in the end, the deepest wound was never the insult about money. It was the assumption buried underneath it. The assumption that a struggling woman could be outloved by a richer room. The assumption that polish proves character. The assumption that a mother in grief is easier to replace than to support. Those are old lies, expensive lies, dangerous lies. And that day, for one long hard morning, they finally ran into something stronger than money and smoother than performance. They ran into the truth. She was never too poor to deserve her child. They were just too blind to see her strength until the whole room was forced to. And maybe that is the part I hope people carry with them when the story is over. The people who underestimate you are often counting the wrong things. They count your money, your losses, your tired eyes, your silence, your seasons of survival. They do not count what matters, because what matters cannot be itemized. The hand that gets up again, the heart that keeps showing up, the spine that stays straight even while it's shaking. By the time they notice those things, the verdict is already turning.